The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Tom Harrington's mansion, casting golden patterns on the polished wooden floors. The air was still, save for the quiet hum of a distant vacuum as one of the housekeepers attended to her tasks. Tom stood in his expansive living room, rehearsing lines for an upcoming role. His voice carried through the room, confident and commanding, every word carefully enunciated. He was at the pinnacle of his career, his name a fixture on marquees and magazine covers. Fans adored him. Directors sought him, and his peers envied him. Yet, for all his fame and fortune, Tom had grown impatient with the world beyond his glamorous bubble. As he practiced his lines, a sudden knock at the door interrupted him. Tom sighed, setting the script on a marble table. He hadn't been expecting anyone, and the intrusion felt unwelcome. He approached the door, his footsteps echoing in the grand hallway, and opened it with a swift motion. Before him stood a man who seemed entirely out of place against the opulence of Tom's home. He was dressed in tattered clothes, his face gaunt and weary, eyes downcast as though accustomed to rejection. His hands trembled slightly as he clutched his hat. "Good morning, sir," the man said, his voice hesitant. I was wondering if you could spare something to eat, or even just a glass of water." Tom blinked, taken aback by the sight and the audacity. For a moment, he considered slamming the door without a word, but curiosity held him there. "Do you think this is a soup kitchen?" Tom's tone was sharp, his words cutting. "What makes you think you can just walk up to a stranger's house and beg?" The man flinched but held his ground. "I didn't mean to offend, sir. I've fallen on hard times and thought, perhaps, someone as fortunate as yourself might show kindness." Tom's eyes narrowed. "Fortunate," he scoffed. "Fortune has nothing to do with it. I've worked hard for everything I have. Maybe you should try doing the same." The man nodded slightly, his expression unreadable. "You're right, sir. I'll not trouble you further." He turned and walked away, his steps slow and measured, as though he bore not just the weight of hunger, but of the world's indifference. Tom watched him for a moment before closing the door with a firm click. He returned to his script, but the encounter lingered in his mind like a splinter. "Ridiculous," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. The rest of the morning passed uneventfully. Tom went through his routine, spoke briefly with his agent, and prepared for a meeting at the studio. He was to meet the director of his next film, a mysterious figure whose name alone commanded respect in the industry. Tom had yet to meet him in person, but had heard whispers of his genius. Arriving at the studio, Tom strode confidently into the conference room. The producers greeted him warmly, showering him with the praise he had come to expect. The room buzzed with energy, anticipation thick in the air. Then the door opened, and in walked the man from Tom's doorstep. Tom froze, his confident demeanor faltering. The man was no longer clad in rags but in a tailored suit, his posture upright and commanding. His eyes, however, remained the same, piercing, observant, and carrying a weight that made Tom uneasy. "Good afternoon," the man said, his voice steady and authoritative. "I am Jonathan Drake, director of this project." The room fell silent, all eyes shifting between Tom and Jonathan. For a moment, Tom thought it must be some elaborate joke, but the solemnity in Jonathan's expression told him otherwise. Jonathan's gaze settled on Tom. "Mr. Harrington, it seems our paths crossed earlier today." Tom's face flushed with embarrassment. He opened his mouth to speak, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. Jonathan continued, addressing the room as much as Tom. "In storytelling, we often explore the depths of human character. We craft heroes and villains, but the truth lies in the choices we make when no one is watching. Today, I had the chance to see such a choice unfold." Tom's hands clenched at his sides. He wanted to protest, to defend himself, but his voice failed him. "I have no intention of embarrassing you further, Mr. Harrington," Jonathan said, his tone softening slightly. "But I do hope today serves as a lesson, not just for you, but for all of us. Fame and success do not absolve us of our humanity." Tom lowered his head, his usual bravado replaced with quiet shame. The producers shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to proceed. After a long pause, Jonathan smiled faintly and addressed the group. Now, let us move forward. The work we do here is important, and I believe Mr. Harrington has the talent to bring this story to life. The meeting resumed, but for Tom, the words and plans blurred into the background. Jonathan's presence loomed large, a constant reminder of the day's events. As the session concluded and people began to disperse, Tom approached Jonathan. "I'm sorry," Tom said quietly, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "I didn't recognize you. I acted poorly." Jonathan studied him for a moment before nodding. "Apologies are a start, Mr. Harrington, but what matters is how you choose to act moving forward." Tom nodded, his resolve hardening. "I'll do better. I promise." Jonathan extended his hand and Tom shook it, the gesture both a truce and a challenge. As Tom left the studio that day, he carried with him not just the weight of his own shame, but a newfound determination to prove that he could be more than just a celebrated actor. He could be a better man. The following days passed in a blur for Tom Harrington. His name was still on every marquee. His face still adorned the covers of every magazine. Yet something deep within him had shifted. It wasn't just the work at the studio. It was the encounter with Jonathan Drake that had unraveled something inside him. The words "fame and success do not absolve us of our humanity" echoed in his mind, haunting him like a whisper that refused to be silenced. Tom could no longer go about his life in the same way. The weight of that moment, the look in Jonathan's eyes, was impossible to forget. At first, Tom's attempts at change were small, almost imperceptible. He found himself opening doors for others, offering a word of kindness here and there. He began to notice the little moments in life. The quiet grace of a stranger's smile, the hard work of his crew members, the humble nature of the staff who had always worked behind the scenes. For the first time, he saw these people not as tools for his success, but as individuals, each deserving of respect and kindness. One afternoon, Tom was walking through the studio lot, lost in his thoughts. His steps were purposeful, but his mind was elsewhere. On the script he'd just received, on the next role he was set to play, and on how he could make this film different. As he walked, he noticed a familiar face in the distance. It was a crew member, one who had worked on several of Tom's previous films. Tom had never paid him much attention before, seeing him as just another part of the production machine. But today, something was different. The crew member was struggling to carry a heavy load of equipment, his face flushed with effort. Without thinking, Tom approached him. "Hey, let me help with that," Tom said, offering his hand. The crew member looked up, surprised. "Mr. Harrington, you don't need to." "It's nothing," Tom said with a smile, lifting the equipment without hesitation. "We're all in this together, right?" The crew member hesitated for a moment, then nodded, clearly appreciative. As they walked together toward the storage area, the man spoke. "You know, sir, you've always been one of the most professional actors I've worked with. It's not easy, keeping up that level of performance, day in and day out." Tom nodded, feeling a sense of gratitude for the work they did together. "You're the ones who make it happen," he said sincerely. "Without people like you, none of this would be possible." They reached the storage area, and Tom handed over the equipment. The crew member thanked him and walked away, but not before giving Tom a genuine smile. Tom watched him go, feeling a warmth in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just the act of helping someone. It was a realization that he had been blind to the lives of those around him for so long. He had lived in a bubble of luxury, where everything was provided for him, and he never stopped to consider the sacrifices of others. The next day, Tom arrived at the set early. As he walked through the soundstage, he passed by Jonathan Drake, who was reviewing the script with one of the producers. Jonathan looked up and saw Tom approaching. "Mr. Harrington," Jonathan said, his tone neutral but with a hint of curiosity. "How are you today?" Tom smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. "Better than I've ever been," he replied, his voice genuine. Jonathan raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. I see. Well, I'm glad to hear it. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, Tom continued, his voice steady. About fame and humanity. You were right, Jonathan. I've been so caught up in myself. I didn't see the world around me. Jonathan regarded him for a moment, his expression unreadable. I'm glad to hear that, Mr. Harrington. But words are just words. It's actions that matter. Tom nodded. I know. I've been trying to change. It's not easy, but I'm trying. Jonathan smiled slightly, the first sign of warmth Tom had seen from him. Good. I think you'll find it's worth the effort. Over the following weeks, Tom made it a point to engage more with the people on set. He took the time to learn their names, ask about their families, and listen to their stories. He went out of his way to show gratitude, whether it was a kind word for the makeup artist or a compliment for the lighting crew. He began to see the people around him not as means to an end, but as equals, each playing their part in the grand performance of life. One evening, after a long day of shooting, Tom found himself in the quiet of his dressing room, alone with his thoughts. He looked in the mirror, studying his reflection. The man staring back at him was familiar, yet not the same. The face was still the one people recognized, handsome, confident, an actor at the peak of his career. But there was something different in his eyes, a softness, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. Tom knew that this was the person he wanted to be, the man who could look himself in the mirror and say, I've done my best, and I've learned along the way. The next day, Tom arrived on set with a new sense of purpose. He walked past Jonathan, who was deep in conversation with the producers. When Jonathan saw him, he gave him a nod, a silent acknowledgement of the change he had noticed in Tom. Mr. Harrington, Jonathan said, his voice calm, but filled with a sense of approval. I've been watching your work lately, and I have to say, it's been impressive. Tom smiled, a mixture of humility and pride in his expression. Thank you, Jonathan. It means a lot coming from you. I've seen a difference in you, Jonathan continued, his tone still measured but not without warmth. You've become more than just an actor. You've become someone who understands the importance of the story, not just in the script, but in life. And that's something rare. Tom's heart swelled with gratitude. For the first time in a long while, he felt as though he was truly seen. It wasn't his fame or his performance that mattered. It was who he had become. As the film neared completion, Tom found himself working harder than ever, not just because he wanted to give the best performance of his life, but because he wanted to prove to himself that he had learned something invaluable. The crew and cast had noticed the difference, too. There was a new sense of camaraderie on set, a spirit of teamwork that had been lacking before. Tom was no longer the star who demanded attention, but a colleague who worked alongside others, respecting their contributions as much as his own. On the final day of shooting, as the crew packed up the equipment and the actors said their goodbyes, Tom approached Jonathan once again. This time, there was no awkwardness, no need for apologies, just a shared understanding. You did good work, Mr. Harrington, Jonathan said, offering his hand. Tom took it firmly, his smile sincere. Thank you, Jonathan, for everything. As he walked off the set for the last time, Tom felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had learned that fame was fleeting, but kindness, respect, and understanding were what truly mattered. He had found something more valuable than any award or accolade. He had found a path to becoming the man he wanted to be. And as Tom left the studio lot, he knew that the journey ahead was not just about acting or success. It was about living a life that mattered, not just to him, but to everyone he encountered. The world, he realized, was full of stories waiting to be told, not just on the screen, but in every interaction,